The leather-bound journal hit the floor of the Redemption Creek saloon with a crack that silenced every conversation in the room. Celia Cooper stood at the center of that silence, her chest heaving, her dark eyes blazing with something that was equal parts fury and devastation. She had found it. After 3 months of living beside Cyrus Chandler, of watching him build walls from timber and silence and deliberate coldness, she had found the one thing he had sworn did not exist inside him. The journal lay open on the sawdust-covered floor. The handwriting was unmistakably his, that angular, cramped script that she had only ever seen on cattle tallies and land deeds. But these were not cattle tallies. These were pages soaked in longing, in grief, in wonder, in the exact kind of aching beauty that Cyrus Chandler had looked her dead in the eyes and told her was impossible. "You told me," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper, which somehow made it louder than a shout in that terrible quiet. "You told me you had no poetry in you." Cyrus Chandler had not moved. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches of rigid, sunburned silence behind the bar, his jaw locked, his gray eyes fixed on the open journal on the floor as if it were a rattlesnake that had just uncoiled itself in his home. Every person in that saloon, Hector Vane with his boot on the brass rail, the Delgado brothers at the card table, Agnes Prout who kept the accounts, every single one of them was absolutely still. "Celia," he said, "just her name, nothing else." "Do not say my name like that," she said, and the tremor in her voice was not weakness. It was the sound of a woman who had been told she was imagining something and had just proven catastrophically and publicly that she was not. "Do not say it like I am the one who did something wrong here." She bent down. She picked up the journal. Her hands were shaking, but her spine was straight and her chin was level, and every single person watching understood that they were witnessing something enormous. She opened to the page she had found first, the page that had stopped her breath when she had reached for it by accident in the saddlebag he had left on the kitchen table. The page she had told herself she had misread, had misunderstood, had projected her own desperate hoping onto, until she had read it a second time, and a third, and understood with absolute terrible clarity that every word was real. She read it aloud. She read every word of it in that silent saloon, and by the time she finished, 2 of the women in the room had tears on their faces, and Cyrus Chandler looked like a man who had just been asked to survive something he had not prepared himself to survive. And the story of how they had arrived at this impossible, shattering, luminous moment had begun exactly 1 year before, on a platform at the end of a railroad spur in the territory of New Mexico, in the dust and the heat and the merciless clarity of a September afternoon in 1882. Celia Cooper had not expected much. That was the honest truth of it. She had not expected much from Redemption Creek, and she had not expected much from the arrangement that had brought her there, and she certainly had not expected much from Cyrus Chandler. She had been practical about the whole enterprise. She was 24 years old. She was alone in the world in the particular way that orphaned women were alone in 1882, and she had spent 4 years teaching school in a small Tennessee town, where the future stretched in front of her like a straight road going nowhere interesting. When a woman who worked with her father's former business partner had quietly mentioned that there were men out west who advertised for wives, capable women, honest women, women who were not afraid of hard work, Celia had read the advertisement twice, then written a careful letter that was honest and clear, and said nothing she did not mean. The advertisement had been placed by a rancher in New Mexico territory named Cyrus Chandler. He was 31 years old. He ran cattle on 800 acres south of a small town called Redemption Creek. He required a wife who could cook and manage accounts and was not frightened of solitude. He offered respectful treatment and a permanent home. He was not looking for romance. He had stated this plainly. He was not looking for romance, and he was not a man given to demonstrations of feeling, and any woman who required that kind of thing would find the arrangement unsatisfactory. Celia had written back that she was not looking for romance either. She had written that she valued honesty above flattery and that she was perfectly capable of managing accounts. She had not said that she was frightened of the solitude he described, because she had not believed she was. She had not said that his caveat about romance had landed somewhere in her chest with the peculiar weight of a challenge, because she had not understood it as that yet. They had exchanged 6 letters over the course of 2 months. His letters were brief and informational. He wrote about the land, the cattle numbers, the state of the ranch house, the well, the nearest town. He wrote in the same cramped, angular hand she would later see in that journal, and the letters contained no warmth at all, but they contained no dishonesty either, and Celia had valued that. She had arrived on a Wednesday. He had been at the platform waiting, which she had appreciated. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with gray eyes the color of winter sky and a face that was not conventionally handsome, but was arresting in the way that faces shaped by outdoor work and private sorrow tended to be. He had removed his hat when he saw her. He had said, "Miss Cooper," and she had said, "Mr. Chandler," and they had shaken hands like business partners, which was essentially what they were. The ride out to the ranch had taken 40 minutes along a dirt road that wound through creosote flats and rose slightly toward a low ridge of red-brown hills. Cyrus Chandler had driven the wagon. He had not attempted to fill the silence with pleasantries, and Celia had looked out at the landscape and thought it was the most alien thing she had ever seen in her life. The sky was enormous and terrifyingly blue. The light was a quality of light she had no vocabulary for, yet hard and golden and without mercy. "It is very dry," she had said, finally, because the silence had become something she needed to test. "October through March is better," he had said. "We get rain in the spring." "Do you like it here?" she had asked. He had considered the question for a moment, which she had found unexpectedly interesting. Most men she knew would have answered it immediately and without thought. He had looked out at the scrub and the red hills and the enormous sky, and he had said, "Yes." And there had been something in that single word that was not simple or easy, that had been considered and chosen and meant. She had filed that away somewhere. The ranch house was plain but solid. Adobe brick with a good tin roof, a deep covered porch along the front, a kitchen that was better equipped than she had expected, 2 bedrooms separated by a sitting room. He had shown her to her room without ceremony, and told her supper was whatever she could make from what was in the larder, and that he was going back out to see to the horses. She had made cornmeal porridge with dried beef and canned peaches and set it on the table, and when he had come in and eaten it without complaint and said it was good, she had understood that this was the register of their communication. Functional, direct, without ornamentation. She had told herself she could live in that register. She had told herself it suited her. She was not entirely wrong. There was a relief in those first weeks in the clarity of her position and her purpose. She cooked and she cleaned and she kept the accounts, which were in considerably worse shape than his letters had implied, and she worked in the small kitchen garden, and she helped where she could with the work of the ranch. His hired hands were 2 men, an older Mexican cowhand named Ernesto Vega, who had been at the Chandler Ranch for 11 years and spoke to Celia with grave courtesy from the very first day, and a younger man named Pete Dolan, who was cheerful and careless and was not actually very good with cattle but could fix almost anything mechanical, which Cyrus valued. The arrangement worked. It was not warm, and it was not intimate, and it was not anything like the life she might have imagined for herself in some younger and more fanciful part of her mind. But it worked. She and Cyrus Chandler treated each other with consistent respect and divvied up the labor of a working ranch in a way that made logical sense. And at night they sat on opposite sides of the sitting room after supper, she reading or sewing, he working on tallies or ledgers, and occasionally one of them would say something practical, and the other would respond, and that was conversation. The thing that broke the first small crack in his walls was the bookshelf. She had not noticed it immediately because it was in the corner of the sitting room behind a cedar chest and was not prominently displayed. When she finally moved the chest during a cleaning effort in her second week, she found a shelf that held perhaps 40 books, not a remarkable number in itself, but a remarkable selection for a cattle rancher in New Mexico Territory in 1882. There were volumes of poetry. There was Tennyson, Whitman, Keats. There were novels, Dickens, George Eliot, a battered copy of Jane Eyre with the spine cracked open at multiple points. There was a book of Greek mythology with penciled notes in the margins. She had been standing there looking at this shelf with her hand resting on the Tennyson when she had heard him come in from outside and stop in the doorway of the sitting room. "You read poetry," she had said. It was not an accusation. It was just a fact she was presenting to him. "I used to," he had said. "These are well-used books," she had said, meaning it as the observation it was. There had been a pause. "My mother's," he had said then. "She brought them from Virginia." She had turned and looked at him, and there had been something in his face that was not quite pain and not quite memory, but was something that lived in that neighborhood. She had wanted very much to ask about his mother, but she had understood, with the instinct she was beginning to develop around him, that this was not the moment. "May I borrow the Tennyson?" she had asked. "You can borrow anything you like," he had said. "They have been sitting there long enough." She had taken the Tennyson to bed that night and read it by the light of her oil lamp, and thought about the man in the next room who had this shelf full of his mother's poetry behind a chest where nobody could see it, and who had said in his advertisement that he was not given to demonstrations of feeling and was not looking for romance. She had not been fanciful about it. She had simply thought about it and held it and carried it with her into the next day. Their first real argument happened 3 weeks after her arrival and concerned the accounts. Celia had gone through the ledgers carefully and had found a pattern of payments to a supplier in Santa Fe that seemed to be a significant overcharge. The same quantity of cattle feed and tack arriving at substantially higher prices than the records suggested were standard. She had raised it at supper, presenting her calculations clearly and without drama. Cyrus had looked at her figures and said the arrangement with the Santa Fe supplier was long-standing, and he preferred to keep things as they were. Celia had asked why. He had said it was not her concern. She had said, with remarkable patience, that if she was keeping his accounts then it was in fact her concern, and that the overcharge amounted to nearly $200 per year, which was not nothing. He had pushed back from the table and told her he was well aware of what $200 was worth, and he did not need it explained to him. She had said she was not explaining the value of money to him. She was explaining that he was being robbed. The word had landed in the room like a stone in still water. He had stared at her from across the table for a long moment, and his gray eyes had been absolutely unreadable, and she had held his gaze and not backed down, because she had been right, and she had known she was right, and she was not in the habit of pretending otherwise. He had said nothing more that evening. He had stood up and gone outside, and she had heard him moving around the porch for a long time before she heard him come in and go to his room. In the morning he had placed a letter on the kitchen table addressed to a supplier in Albuquerque, asking about feed and tack prices. He had not said anything about it. He had eaten his breakfast and gone out to work. Celia had looked at the letter and understood, with a warm certainty that she deliberately did not examine too closely, that this was how Cyrus Chandler admitted he had been wrong. The Santa Fe supplier was dropped. The Albuquerque supplier reduced their annual costs by nearly $240. Cyrus said nothing about it. But after that, when Celia raised something in the accounts, he listened. October came in with a shift of wind that carried real cold for the first time, and Celia began to understand what he had meant about it being better October through March. The light changed. The scrub acquired a kind of muted beauty that it had not possessed in the brutal honesty of September. She started walking in the evenings, just a half-mile out and back along the Ridge Road, and on the 4th or 5th evening she had looked up and stopped walking because the sky to the west was doing something she had no word for. It was not just sunset. It was as if the entire western horizon were made of liquid copper, and the few thin clouds were the darkest purple-black she had ever seen, and the land below it was all deep shadow and red warmth, and the space between earth and sky was something that made her feel small and vast simultaneously. She had stood there for 20 minutes. When she turned back toward the ranch, Cyrus was sitting on the porch steps. "You should not walk that far alone at dusk," he said. "There are things in this country that are dangerous at dusk." She had thought about pointing out that she was a grown woman who had managed herself adequately for 24 years and did not require instructions about twilight. But she had looked at the sky behind her and then at him, and she had said, "Did you see that?" He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "Yes." "What do you call that?" she had asked. "That color." He had looked at the sky for a long time. "I do not have a word for it," he had said. She had sat down on the porch steps, not next to him but close enough that she could see his face in the last of the light, and she had said, "Your mother's Tennyson. I read it last night, the poem about the eagle." He had been quiet. "He clasps the crag with crooked hands," she had said, "close to the sun in lonely lands. I thought about that this evening, out there on the ridge." Something had moved across his face that was not a smile but was something in the territory of feeling that preceded a smile, the territory he apparently would not allow himself to enter. He had said, "She used to read that one when I was young." "Where is she now?" Celia had asked, gently but directly. "She died," he had said, 8 years ago, fever." "I am sorry," Celia had said. "So am I," he had said. They had sat on the porch in the cooling dark and said nothing for a while, and it was the first silence between them that had felt like something chosen rather than something defaulted to. Celia had filed that away too. She was accumulating a ledger of a different kind, not numbers but moments. The way he moved around the kitchen in the morning with a kind of quiet efficiency that was almost graceful. The low way he spoke to the horses, not sweet-talking them but murmuring to them in a register that was private and easy. The fact that he always picked up the coffee pot with his left hand and poured it with the slight forward tilt that told her the years of the same motion had made it automatic. The way his jaw tightened when Pete Dolan said something foolish, and the way he managed his frustration by simply looking elsewhere until it passed. The note she had found tucked between 2 posts of the porch, written in his hand, that said only, "Looked like the mountains were breathing this morning." She had found it on a Tuesday, and she had not known whether to mention it or keep it to herself, and she had kept it to herself, but she had thought about it continuously for 4 days. He had poetry in him whether he knew it or not. She had been certain of that from the moment she found the shelf, but she had not yet found the journal, and she had not yet understood the depth and dimension of what he had been hiding from her and from himself and from the world. November brought a crisis that had nothing to do with poetry and everything to do with the fragile and contested nature of land and water in New Mexico Territory in 1882. A man named Devlin Marsh had ranched to the north of Cyrus for 12 years, and there had always been a dispute about where the water rights to a creek called Draper's Run actually belonged. The creek ran along a line between their properties, and the previous summer a drought had made it the primary water source for both their herds, and the argument had become something uglier than an argument. Celia knew about the dispute from the accounts. There were legal fees in the ledger from the previous year. What she had not known was how personal and active the hostility was until the morning she was hanging washing on the line behind the house, and 2 riders came fast along the ridge road and turned into the ranch yard, and she recognized neither of them, and they had the look of men who had been sent rather than men who had come of their own accord. They told her to get Chandler. She told them Chandler was out on the South Range and would not be back until mid-afternoon. They told her to give him a message. The message was that Devlin Marsh was filing new papers with the county, and that if Chandler wanted to avoid a legal fight that would cost more than the creek was worth, he ought to come to a meeting in Redemption Creek the following Friday and talk things over before it went further. She relayed this to Cyrus at supper. He had listened without expression, and then he had said that Marsh had been trying to take that water for 12 years and was not going to stop because he sent polite messages, and he was not going to a meeting in Redemption Creek that Marsh had organized on terms Marsh had set. Celia had said she understood that, but she asked whether there was a legal basis for his claim to the water rights. He had said the original land grant was ambiguous, and the territorial courts had been inconsistent on similar questions. She had said that meant it could go either way if it went to a full legal proceeding. He had said yes. She had thought about it and said, "What does Marsh actually want? Does he want the water or does he want your land?" The question had made him look at her differently, not with surprise exactly, but with something that was recalibrating, as if he had been expecting a different kind of response from her and was adjusting his understanding accordingly. "Both, probably," he had said, "but he would settle for the water." "Then perhaps there is a way to settle the water question without giving him the opening he needs to make it about the land," she had said. He had said nothing for a moment. Then he had said, "You think like someone who has handled disputes before." "I handled parents for 4 years," she had said. "Schoolteachers handle more disputes in a week than most lawyers handle in a month." He had almost smiled. It was the closest he had come, in 2 months, to an actual smile, and it had hit her somewhere between her ribcage and her spine in a way she had decided was purely observational. It was not purely observational. She had known it was not purely observational for at least 3 weeks before that moment. She had been very disciplined about not acknowledging it, because acknowledging it seemed like the kind of thing that could only end in difficulty, given that Cyrus Chandler had told her directly, and in writing, that he was not a man given to demonstrations of feeling and was not looking for romance. She was not going to be the woman who walked into a practical arrangement with clear eyes and then made it complicated by wanting things that had not been offered. But wanting things that had not been offered was apparently something she did not entirely have control over. They went to Redemption Creek that Friday, both of them, which was not what either Marsh's writers or Cyrus himself had originally proposed. Celia had suggested that going together, as a united front, with her having reviewed all the relevant documents, would put them in a better position than Cyrus going alone and managing it through pride and stubbornness. He had looked at her for a long time when she said this, and then he had said, "Fine." Redemption Creek was not large. It had a main street with the usual collection of enterprises: the saloon that Hector Vane owned and operated, a general mercantile, a small hotel called the Western House, a livery, a land office, a doctor's surgery, and a building that served as both courthouse and town meeting hall. The community was perhaps 400 people, mostly ranchers and their families and the service businesses that ranchers required. There was a small Catholic mission at the southern end of town that served the Mexican and mixed families in the area, and Ernesto Vega's sister, Rosa, attended Mass there each Sunday and occasionally sent corn tortillas to the Chandler Ranch via her brother, which Celia had come to regard as one of the genuinely good things about life in New Mexico territory. Devlin Marsh was already in the meeting hall when they arrived. He was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now predominantly expressing grievance. He had 2 men with him who were not lawyers. Cyrus had Celia and his own controlled quietness. The meeting was tense and circular for the better part of an hour. Marsh made his claims. Cyrus countered them. Celia watched and listened and kept notes, and at one point, when the conversation had stalled into the same argument being made for the 3rd time, she said quietly but clearly that she had reviewed the original 1869 land grant documentation, and the relevant sections were in fact less ambiguous than had been suggested, and that she could produce a specific reading of the territorial court's 1877 ruling in a parallel water rights case that would substantially support Mr. Chandler's position, and that she wondered whether it might be worth consulting with an attorney about that ruling before anyone filed anything further. There had been a silence. Marsh had looked at her with the particular expression men of his type reserved for women who said things they had not been invited to say. But Celia had held his gaze with absolute serenity, and Cyrus had said nothing, but she had felt the shift in his attention beside her, felt it as clearly as if he had spoken. The meeting had not resolved anything definitively, but it had given Marsh enough to think about that he had not immediately filed the new papers, and the dispute had entered a slower and less immediately threatening phase. As they drove home in the late afternoon, Celia had watched the light change over the red hills and thought about the territorial court ruling and what additional documentation she might request from the land office. "Where did you learn to do that?" Cyrus had said, after a long silence. "Do what?" she had said. "Make a room go quiet without raising your voice," he had said. She had thought about that. "My father," she had said finally. "He was a schoolmaster too before he was ill. He said the voice was a tool and should be used with economy." "He was right," Cyrus had said. "He was right about most things," she had said. "He died when I was 19. I have been on my own since then, more or less." Another silence. The wagon wheels turned in the dry road. "I was 18 when my father died," Cyrus had said. She had looked at him. He had been watching the horses. "He died in a fire," he had said, "in the original ranch house. I built this one after." She had not said she was sorry because she had said it before and it had not been what he needed. She had said, "You built it yourself." "Ernesto helped," he had said. "It is a good house," she had said. He had said nothing to that. But something in the set of his shoulders had shifted, almost imperceptibly, and Celia had understood that in the particular language that governed communication between the two of them, she had said the right thing. She began, in November and December, to stop pretending she was not paying close attention to him. Not in any demonstrative way. She was not demonstrative by nature, and she was well aware that demonstration would send him into a retreat that she might not be able to reverse. But she stopped averting her eyes when she caught herself watching him. She stopped pretending the observations she filed away were merely practical. She let herself notice things. She noticed that he worked harder than any man she had ever seen without ever appearing to hurry. She noticed that he fed the horses before himself always, without exception. She noticed that he never spoke carelessly, that he chose his words the way she had seen her father choose them, with a deliberateness that was not slowness but care. She noticed that when Ernesto's horse threw a shoe and Ernesto had to walk back from the South Range in the heat, Cyrus had said nothing to him about it, but the next morning there had been new shoes on all 4 of Ernesto's horse's feet, done in the night. She noticed that he read the almanac every Sunday morning and made notes in the margins in that cramped, angular hand. She had been standing at the kitchen window on a morning in early December watching him carry a water trough across the yard. The old one had cracked, when she had thought with perfect clarity, "I am in danger of loving this man." She had been still with that thought for almost a full minute. Then she had gone back to making breakfast and had been very quiet about it. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a modest affair. There was a service at the mission, which Ernesto attended, and which Celia went to as well, not because she was Catholic but because she wanted to hear singing. Cyrus did not go. He stayed at the ranch, and when she came back he had put a small parcel on the kitchen table wrapped in brown paper. She had opened it and found a new pen with a good steel nib and 2 bottles of ink, one black, one a deep burgundy color. She had looked at the pen and at him and she had said, "How did you know I had almost run out?" "You have been scraping the bottle since last week," he had said. "The burgundy was available at the mercantile. I thought you might find it interesting." It was not a romantic gesture. It was an observational one. It was, in its own way, exactly as intimate. She had said, "Thank you, Cyrus," and had used his first name for the first time, not accidentally but deliberately, and he had received it with a stillness that told her it had registered. She had given him a new leather notebook she had ordered from the mercantile 3 weeks earlier, thinking he could use it for the accounts. He had held it for a moment and then placed it carefully on his end of the table and said, "Thank you, Celia," and the sound of her name in his voice was something she spent the rest of the evening trying not to think about. January came in cold, and January was when things began, in small and unannounced ways, to shift between them. She was not sure what initiated it. There was no single event. It was more like a slow tide change, the kind that you only notice when you look back from where you are standing and realize the waterline has moved. He began to linger at the kitchen table after supper rather than taking his papers immediately to the sitting room. He began to sometimes say things that were not functional observations about the weather, once or twice something that was almost a joke, a dry and so quiet she might have missed it kind of wit that she had not known he possessed. She found a dead wildflower on the kitchen windowsill one morning that she had seen the previous afternoon in a crack in the rock near the south pasture gate, and there was no practical reason for it to be on her windowsill. She did not mention the wildflower. She put it in her water glass as if it were a deliberate vase arrangement and left it there, and she did not look at him specifically when she did it, but she was aware of him being aware of it, and that awareness of awareness was something she turned over in her mind for days. She had also, by this point, been reading all of his mother's books. She had moved through the Tennyson and the Keats and the Whitman, and had now arrived at the George Eliot, and sometimes after supper she read aloud. She had begun doing it almost without deciding to. She had been reading to herself, and had come to a sentence that struck her as particularly good, and had simply said it aloud. And he had looked up from his papers, and she had continued, and he had set down his pencil and listened, and that had become a thing they did in the evenings. He never said anything explicitly about enjoying it. But when she stopped, he would look at her with a particular quality of attention that told her without words that the stopping had registered as a loss. February brought 2 weeks of genuine cold, ice on the water troughs in the mornings, and a wind that came off the high country to the north with a real bite to it. The cattle required more work in cold weather, and Cyrus and Ernesto and Pete were out long hours, and Celia kept the house warm and the meals substantial, and on 3 separate occasions had hot coffee and food waiting when Cyrus came in cold and exhausted. And she did not make a production of this because it was simply what needed doing. But the 3rd time he had stood in the kitchen doorway with cold-reddened hands and looked at the table and then at her and said, "You do not have to do this." And she had said, "I know," and that had been the whole conversation. On a February night when the wind was particularly bad, the lamp in the sitting room had run out of oil, and neither of them had been willing to get up from the relative warmth of the room to fetch more from the kitchen, and they had sat there in the firelight on opposite sides of the room, and Celia had been reading the Whitman from memory. She had memorized quite a lot of it by now, and the firelight had been doing something remarkable to the shadows on the ceiling, and Cyrus had said, from his chair in the dark, "Do you miss Tennessee?" She had thought about it honestly. "I miss the green," she had said. "It is very green there. I miss being surrounded by trees. But I do not miss my life there particularly." "Why did you come here, really?" he had said, not accusingly, with genuine curiosity. She had considered the honest answer. "Because I wanted something that was mine," she had said. "A life that was actually mine, that I had built, not a diminished version of someone else's vision of what I ought to be." A long silence. "That is not what most women would say," he had said. "Perhaps," she had said. "What would you have expected me to say?" "That you wanted security," he had said, "or a family, the practical things. Those things matter," she had said, "but they are not the whole of it." Another silence, this one with a different texture, softer at the edges. "What made you place the advertisement?" she had asked, because she had wanted to know for 5 months and had waited until the right moment. He had been quiet for so long that she had thought he was not going to answer. Then he had said, "The silence was getting heavy." She had sat with that. The silence was getting heavy. She had filed that sentence into the ledger she kept of him, and she had known, in the deepest and most honest place in herself, that she was already gone. That this man with his walls and his hidden bookshelf and his wildflower on her windowsill and his silence getting heavy had already become the architecture of her inner life. She had said nothing more about it that night. But when she had gone to bed, she had taken out the new pen he had given her for Christmas, the one with the burgundy ink, and she had written for the first time in months. Not a letter to anyone, just words on paper. The way the firelight had been, The way he had said that sentence. The way the wind was doing something that sounded, if you were slightly fanciful about it, like it was trying to get in not because it was cold, but because it was lonely. March brought the rain he had promised her, and the land changed in a way that genuinely amazed her. Things bloomed in the desert that she had not known were there, had been waiting in the dry earth all those months for permission. She went on her ridge walks again, and the landscape was full of yellow and purple, and a very specific shade of sage green that she tried to describe in a letter to a friend in Tennessee and could not quite manage. Cyrus joined her on the ridge walk one evening in mid-March. He did not announce this intention. He simply appeared beside her when she was 20 yards from the house, and they walked together in silence up the ridge road, and the sky was doing its remarkable evening thing. And when they reached the high point of the road where the whole valley opened up below and the mountains were visible to the north, still carrying their winter white on the peaks, they had both stopped and looked. "There," Celia had said quietly. "Yes," he had said. That was all. But they had stood there for 10 minutes before turning back, and he had been close enough that their arms had nearly been touching, and the nearly had been its own particular kind of eloquence. He joined her on the ridge walks after that. Not every evening. Some evenings he was too tired or the work ran too long, but most evenings when the light was worth watching, which was most evenings. They did not always talk. Sometimes they walked the full mile and back in comfortable quiet, but sometimes they talked, and what she discovered in those conversations was something that undid her steadily and without mercy. He had thoughts about things. Not practical things. He always had those, but ideas, observations, interpretations of the world that were exactly as nuanced and careful as she might have wished for if she had been wishing, which she was by then, despite everything. He had an opinion about whether the territorial government was representing the interests of small ranchers honestly, which it was not, and his analysis of why was precise and unsentimental. He had thoughts about what the railroad was doing to the economy of small towns like Redemption Creek, and whether it was ultimately a benefit or a cost, and he could hold both sides of the question with genuine intellectual honesty. He had watched a particular hawk from the ridge for 2 seasons and had his own informal study of its hunting patterns and territory. She had said one evening, "You are not what your advertisement suggested." He had said, "In what way?" She had said, "You described yourself as a practical man without sentiment, but you have been studying a hawk for 2 years. He had said, "Observation is practical." She had said, "Cyrus." He had turned and looked at her. It was a particular look. The one she had come to understand meant she had gotten past his first line of defense and was now close enough to the actual man that he had stopped performing his own carefully constructed version of himself. She had said, "You can talk to me." A long silence. The hawk, or one very like it, was riding a thermal far above them, turning slow circles. "I know," he had said, and then after another pause, "I am not certain I know how." This was the most honest thing he had said to her, and she had known it. She had said, "You are doing it now." He had said nothing, but he had looked at her for a moment with something in his gray eyes that was undefended and enormous, and then he had looked away at the mountains. And Celia had understood that she needed to hold this carefully and not push, because pushing was exactly the wrong thing, and patience was not passivity, patience was strategy. She was very patient. April deepened and the cattle work became demanding again. And the Devlin Marsh situation flared once more when Marsh's men redirected a section of Draper's Run in a way that was clearly meant to provoke. Cyrus had ridden out to the boundary line with Ernesto to look at it and had come back with his jaw set and his hands very still, which Celia had learned to recognize as his most dangerous quiet. She had said, "Do not do anything tonight." He had looked at her. She had said, "Whatever you are thinking, let me think about the legal options first. Tonight." He had said, "The man moved a creek." She had said, "I know he did. Give me tonight." He had sat down at the kitchen table and let her think. She had gone through every document related to the water rights, and by midnight she had found what she needed, a specific clause in the original Territorial Water Compact of 1870 that made the redirection of a shared water source without mutual consent a prosecutable offense under territorial law. She had written it up in careful language and placed it in front of him at the table. He had read it. He had said, "This holds. If the territorial court in Santa Fe applies it consistently," she had said, "which their record suggests they do in these cases." He had looked at her across the papers and the lamp. His face in that light had been something she would carry for the rest of her life, exhausted and grateful, and seeing her, actually seeing her, in a way that went far past the ledgers and the practical arrangement. He had said, "I do not know what I would do without you." It was not a romantic declaration. She understood that, but it was real and it was his, and she had held it very carefully and said, "You would figure it out, but I am glad I am here." He had said, "So am I." They had held each other's gaze across the table for a moment that stretched beyond the practical register they normally inhabited, and then he had gathered the documents and said good night in his usual way and gone to bed, and Celia had sat alone in the kitchen for another half-hour in the lamplight, thinking about all the things that were being built between them that neither of them had named yet. May came, and with it something she had not anticipated. She had been in the sitting room on a warm afternoon when Cyrus was gone to town for supplies, and she had been dusting the cedar chest that had long since been moved away from the bookshelf, and in moving the chest she had knocked his saddlebag from the table where he had left it, and the saddlebag had fallen open, and among the things that had spilled out onto the floor was a leather-bound journal. She should not have opened it. She had known she should not open it. She had reached for it to set it back on the saddlebag with her eyes averted, the way you would handle something that was clearly someone's private property, and then her fingers had brushed the open page and she had seen a line. One line. She had not meant to read it. She had seen it the way you see something through a window you are not supposed to be looking through. The line was, "The way she reads aloud is the way water finds its level with perfect natural logic, as if language were gravity and she were the only proof of it." She had gone very still. She had read it again and again. She had looked at the handwriting, angular, cramped, unmistakably his. She had then done what she probably should not have done, what she would have done differently if she had been a different person or if the stakes had felt lower. She had read the page. Just the page. Then she had read the one before it, and the one before that, and she had found herself 20 pages deep into a journal that was full, absolutely full, of the interior life of a man who had told her he had no poetry in him. There were observations, the same careful, specific observations she had been making about him, but made from his direction about her. The way she set her jaw when she was calculating something difficult. The burgundy ink on her fingers in the morning when she had been writing the night before. The sound of her in the kitchen before he was quite awake. The particular rhythm of her movements that he had apparently been listening to with an attention that was nearly devotional. There was a passage about the night she had read Whitman in the firelight that was so precise and so unsentimental and so achingly beautiful that she had had to set the journal down and look at the ceiling for a long moment. There was a passage about standing beside her on the ridge and the almost touching of their arms, and how he had spent the entire walk back to the house aware of exactly how many inches separated him from her, and how those inches felt like a question he did not know how to answer. There was a passage, and this was the one that had undone her completely, the one that had still been in the forefront of her mind, when she had walked into the Redemption Creek saloon with the journal in her hands and the world reordering itself around her, that said simply, "I told her I had no poetry in me. I said it in the letter before she came, so she would not expect things I did not know how to give. I was not lying. I believed it, but she has been here 7 months and she has found it anyway. The thing I did not know I had. And I do not know what to do with that except write it down in here where she will never see it." She had closed the journal. She had sat on the floor of the sitting room with the journal in her lap for a very long time. She had felt in equal and overwhelming measure something she might have called joy and something she might have called terror, and something she definitely would have called the fierce and immediate need to do something about this before another day passed, and both of them remained in this careful and constructed distance that was costing them something real. She had heard the wagon in the yard. She had stood up. She had made a decision. She had put the journal in her apron pocket, and she had walked out to the yard, and she had waited while Cyrus unloaded the wagon, and she had looked at him in the late afternoon light and thought about everything that was in those pages, and she had absolutely failed to do what she had intended to do, which was to show him the journal and tell him she had read it, and that she felt the same way. What she had done instead was go inside and make supper and say nothing. She had tried the next morning. She had come into the kitchen and he had been there first, which he sometimes was, and he had looked up from his coffee and said good morning, and she had looked at his face, that particular angular, exhausted, open face, and she had lost her nerve again. This had gone on for 11 days. She carried the journal in her apron pocket every day. She tried to find the right moment. There was no right moment, because the right moment was a thing you created, not a thing you waited for, and she knew this. She absolutely knew this, and yet she had needed a witness. She had needed to understand the size of what she was about to do. Because what she was about to do was not small. She was about to take a man who had hidden his interior life so completely and so deliberately that he had built a chest in front of the bookshelf and written his truest self only in a private journal and kept it in a saddlebag, and she was going to say, "I see you. I found you. This is who you actually are." That was a profound act of revelation. It required the right conditions. What she had not accounted for was that the conditions would be created not by her careful choosing, but by accident, by the journal slipping from her apron pocket as she leaned across the bar in the Redemption Creek saloon to hand Hector Vane the payment for their monthly account, on a Friday afternoon in the middle of May, with half the town in attendance. The crack of it hitting the floor had been loud in the way that only accidents were loud, with the specific embarrassing clarity of something that was not meant to be public becoming public. She had frozen for just a moment, just a breath. And then she had looked at the journal, open on the floor, and she had looked at Cyrus, who had been standing at the bar beside her, and she had seen in his face the exact moment he recognized it. His face had gone from surprise to recognition to something that was the most nakedly afraid she had ever seen him. He had looked at her, and the fear in his eyes was not about anger. It was about exposure. It was the fear of a man who had spent his entire adult life building a wall and had just seen it fall. She had not given herself time to second guess. She had not given him time to retreat. She had looked at him with everything she felt in full visibility on her own face, the years of patience, the months of careful watching, the accumulated love that had been growing quietly and steadily in her since October and was now enormous, and she had said, "You told me you had no poetry in you." And the saloon had gone silent, and she had picked up the journal and she had opened it, and she had read. She read the passage about her reading aloud. She read the passage about the ridge walk and the inches between them and the question he did not know how to answer. She read the passage about the wildflower, which she had not known he had written about, in which he described having carried it in his shirt pocket all the way from the south pasture gate, because it had been the exact color of something he did not have a word for and he had thought she might. She read the passage about the morning she had taken his side in the meeting with Devlin Marsh, in which he had written, "She does not do it for me. She does it because it is right, and that is precisely why it means everything." And then she read the final passage, the one about having no poetry and having been wrong. She read every word of it aloud in that silent saloon, and she did not look up from the page until she had finished. When she did look up, she found Cyrus Chandler standing entirely still, with his hands on the bar behind him, and his gray eyes very bright and absolutely unguarded in a way she had never seen them in 8 months of living beside him. And he was looking at her as if she had done something to him that he was still in the process of understanding the full dimensions of. Agnes Prout had tears on her face. One of the Delgado brothers, the younger one, was staring at the ceiling with his jaw working. Hector Vane, with the instincts of a man who had been running a saloon for 20 years and understood exits, said quietly, "Think I might step out for some air." And the room, as if receiving a signal, began in ones and twos to quietly empty. By the time Celia lowered the journal, they were alone. Cyrus said her name, just that. "Celia," she said, "I know I should not have read it, I know that. I found it by accident and then I read it on purpose, and I have been carrying it for 11 days trying to find the right moment, and there was no right moment, and then I dropped it on the floor in front of everyone, and I am sorry about that part, but I am not sorry about the rest." He was very still. She said, "I came here for a practical arrangement, and I kept telling myself it was staying a practical arrangement, and I was wrong. I have been wrong for months, and I have been patient because I thought that was what you needed, but I am done being patient now. I need you to tell me." She paused. She held his gaze. "I need you to tell me whether what is in this journal is true." A long moment. The longest moment of her life, she would later think, and she had lived through some long moments. Cyrus Chandler stepped out from behind the bar. He crossed the sawdust-covered floor of the Redemption Creek saloon in 3 steps. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to maintain his gaze, and she did maintain it. She did not look away. He said every word. And then he kissed her, right there in Hector Vane's empty saloon, with the afternoon light coming through the dirty windows and the smell of sawdust and tobacco, and the particular New Mexico dry season dust on everything. And it was not a tentative kiss or a polite one. It was the kiss of a man who had been writing his heart into a private journal for months because he did not know how to say it out loud, finally saying it out loud. She kissed him back with 8 months of accumulated feeling and the burgundy ink on her fingers and the ghost of every ridge walk and every firelit evening and every carefully chosen word between them. And when they separated, she had to put her hand on his arm to steady herself because the world had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity and she was still calibrating. He said, with a roughness in his voice that she had never heard before, "I did not know how to tell you." She said, "I know," he said, "I am not good at," and stopped. She said, "You are better at it than you think." He looked down at the journal, still in her hand, and then back at her face, and something in his expression was so completely unguarded that it was almost painful to witness. He said, "I meant what I wrote, about not having poetry in me." She said, "Cyrus, you have been writing poetry about me in secret for 8 months." He said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was absolutely the beginning of a smile, and then became the actual smile, the real one, the one she had been waiting since September to see. "I suppose that is a fair point." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh. She had expected something more solemn, more weighted, but the laugh came up from somewhere genuine, and the relief of it, of the wall coming down and the man on the other side of it being exactly who she had understood him to be, was enormous. He said, "What do we do now?" she said. "We go home, and we have a conversation we should have had months ago, and then we keep building what we have been building." He looked at her for a moment more and then he nodded, and it was a particular kind of nod, not the functional, practical nod of agreement she had been seeing for 8 months, but the nod of a man who had just agreed to something that mattered. They drove home in the late afternoon light with Celia's hand resting on the wagon seat between them, and at some point between Redemption Creek and the ranch gate, his hand had covered hers, and she had turned her hand over, and they had driven the rest of the way home like that, in the warm, still air with the mountains going pink above the northern horizon, and the land doing its evening light tricks around them. The conversation was not easy. This was something she appreciated about him. He did not make it falsely easy. He told her things she had suspected and some she had not, about his mother and what the loss of her had done to him, about his father and the fire and the way he had come to equate keeping his feelings interior with survival, with not giving grief or loss a target, about the years alone on this ranch that had calcified into the silence he had described in his advertisement as if it were a feature and not a wound. about the letters she had written him, all 6 of them, and how he had read each one more times than was warranted, and how the one where she had said she was not frightened of solitude had hit him somewhere he had not expected, because it had been written by someone who understood what solitude actually was. She told him things, too, about her father and the years after his death and the slow erasure of her own ambitions that had happened so gradually she had almost not noticed it, about the advertisement and how it had looked like an exit from a life that was not quite hers, about arriving and looking at the enormous, terrible blue sky and thinking she might have made a terrible mistake, about the bookshelf behind the cedar chest and how that had been the first thing that told her who he actually was, about 11 days of carrying his journal in her apron pocket and losing her nerve daily. He said about the 11 days, "Why did you not just show me?" she said. "Because what is in that journal is enormous. And I did not want to force you into it. I wanted you to come to it yourself." He said, "How was dropping it in Hector Vane's saloon consistent with that plan?" She said, "It was not an entirely consistent plan." He almost laughed. He was getting better at it already, at letting the smile reach its conclusion. She stored this observation in her ledger with the particular care she reserved for the best entries. They were married 3 weeks later, in the small courthouse in Redemption Creek, with Ernesto Vega and his sister Rosa as witnesses and Hector Vane as an additional witness, because he had been in the saloon for the original scene and felt he had earned a stake in the resolution. Celia wore a white lawn dress she had ordered from a catalog out of Santa Fe, and Cyrus wore his good coat that she had previously only seen on the trip to meet Devlin Marsh. And he had combed his hair with an effort that was so sincere she had wanted to tell him he was already perfect, and had settled for straightening his collar, which was an acceptable proxy. They had dinner at the Western House Hotel that evening with Ernesto and Rosa and Pete Dolan, and a few other people from town, who had apparently adopted the romantic trajectory of the Chandler situation as a community interest, including Agnes Prout, who had cried in the saloon and was now openly cheerful about her investment in the outcome. It was a good evening. Celia had not expected to feel so completely at home in it. She had expected a persistent note of foreignness, of having built a life in a place that was not her original place, of the ongoing adjustment of a transplanted person. What she felt instead was something that she eventually identified as simply being where she was supposed to be, a sensation she had not had in Tennessee, had not had in the years of diminished expectations, had not had until somewhere around February of this particular year on a ranch in New Mexico territory. The journey home that night in the dark, with the stars doing their astonishing desert thing above them. She had not been prepared when she arrived here for the stars. The sky in Tennessee was modest by comparison. Here the stars were an argument, she had said to Cyrus, who was driving with her hand in his. "The first night I was here I thought I had made a terrible mistake." He had said, "When did you stop thinking that?" She had said, "When I found your bookshelf." A pause. "The books were behind a chest," he had said. She had said, "I know, that was part of it." He had understood what she meant. He was very good, she had come to realize, at understanding what she meant better than many people who used many more words. He said, "What was the other part?" She thought about it. "When you said yes," she said. "When I asked if you liked it here and you took time to actually answer." He had been quiet with that for a moment. Then he said, "That first day, you asked that question and I thought she is going to be interesting." She said, "Interesting." "It is a serious compliment," she said. "I know it is," and she squeezed his hand and they drove the rest of the way in the star-filled dark. The summer was the best summer of her life, and she said this to herself privately and with full awareness that this was not a comparison she made carelessly. She was not a sentimental woman about her own feelings, and she did not tell herself things that were not true. What made it that was not the large, dramatic events. It was the accumulation of the daily. The mornings when she woke and heard him already in the kitchen, and felt the particular warmth of that knowledge. the evenings on the ridge, which continued and deepened and became the space where they talked about things that neither of them talked about anywhere else. The way he had stopped performing the version of himself that had no poetry in it and had started occasionally. Not constantly, never constantly. He was still Cyrus Chandler, and he would always be a man of economy, saying things that revealed the interior, the careful and rich and unexpected interior that she had found first in a journal, and was now finding daily in the man himself. He gave her the journal. He presented it to her one evening on the porch with the same matter-of-fact delivery with which he gave her everything, but he held it a moment before he let go, and she understood what the holding meant. She had said, "Are you sure?" He had said, "It was written about you. It should be yours." She had kept it on her side of the room, on the shelf with his mother's books, between the Whitman and the George Eliot. He started writing again. Not the journal, he kept a new journal, a separate one that she respected as private, but sometimes he left notes. On the kitchen table, on her windowsill, tucked into the books she was reading. They were short, usually, because he was a man of economy. One morning she found a folded paper in the Keats that said only, "The way you argue with an account book that does not balance is the way I think water argues with rock. Patient and absolutely certain of winning." She had carried that one in her apron pocket for a week. She began, tentatively at first and then with increasing confidence, to write back. Not always notes. Sometimes she left a passage marked in whatever she was reading, a passage that said something she could not quite say directly but that she wanted him to have. He always read them. She always found evidence of this, a pencil mark in the margin. The book moved from where she had left it. It was, she thought, the most elaborate and private conversation she had ever had with anyone. It ran parallel to their spoken conversation and completed it, and was perhaps even truer than it. Because, when you wrote for someone who you knew would read carefully, you could say the things that were too precise or too large for ordinary speech. The Marsh situation resolved itself in August in a way that felt almost anticlimactic after the months of tension. The territorial court in Santa Fe ruled, on the basis of the 1870 compact clause that Celia had identified, that the redirection of Draper's Run had been unlawful and required the restoration of the original course. Marsh had to pay a fine and replace the diverted section at his own cost. He did not speak to Cyrus for the rest of the year, which Cyrus found acceptable. When the letter with the ruling arrived, Celia had read it and set it on the kitchen table and looked at Cyrus and said, "Done." He had read it. He had sat back in his chair. He had let out a long breath. And then he had said, "Come here," in a voice she did not know yet but would come to know very well, and she had gone around the table and he had pulled her into his arms with a thoroughness that said this was not just about the water rights, that this was all of it, all of the months of struggle and uncertainty and the dark past of this ranch and the weight of the solitude that had preceded her, and she had let herself be held with all of it and held him back with all of hers. That was August. In September, on the one-year anniversary of her arrival at the Redemption Creek platform, she had gone out to the porch in the early morning. The light in September was doing its September thing again. That merciless golden quality she had no vocabulary for yet, had tried to describe in 17 different pieces of writing, and found a package on the porch steps. She had opened it and found a new book. Not one of his mother's, a new one recently published, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman that was an edition she had not seen before. Inside the front cover, in his angular, cramped hand, he had written, "For the woman who found something in me that I did not know was there, and who reads it back to me better than I ever wrote it, with the whole of my particular and not especially poetic heart." She had sat on the porch steps in the September morning light and held the book for a very long time. She had thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in this alien place 1 year ago with a practical arrangement, and a clear eye, and no romantic expectations. She had thought about what it had cost him to write that inscription, not the sentiment which was apparently always there, but the act of saying it openly, of committing it to paper in a place where she would see it without ambiguity or deniability. She had gone inside. He had been at the kitchen table with his coffee, watching the door. She had said, "This is not a man who has no poetry in him." He had said, "No, I gather it was there all along." She had said, "It was." He had stood up and come to her, and they had stood in the kitchen in the September morning light, and she had thought, "This is what a life that is actually mine looks like. This is what I came here to find." The second year brought things she had not anticipated in the particular form they took, which was the form of a son. She had suspected it by October and was certain by November, and she had told him on an evening in mid-November on the ridge, which seemed right for things that mattered. She had said it simply, as she said most things. He had stopped walking. He had turned and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. He still had expressions she could not fully read. She expected she always would. It was part of him she had made her peace with and even valued. And then the expression had resolved itself into something that was not the cautious, careful feeling of the man who had advertised for a wife without romance. He had said, "Are you well?" She had said, "Perfectly well." He had said, "Good." And then he had done something she was not expecting. He had sat down right there on the ridge road in the November evening and put his face in his hands and was quiet for a long moment. She had sat down beside him. She had not said anything. After a minute he had raised his head and looked out at the mountains, and she had seen that his eyes were very bright, and she had understood that this was what grief-shaped men did with joy. They went very quiet and they held it privately for a moment before they let it out into the world. She had put her hand on his back. Just her hand, flat between his shoulder blades, feeling his breathing. He had said eventually, "My mother would have," and stopped. She had said, "I know." They had sat on the ridge road in the November dark until the stars came out, and then they had walked home. Winter this time was different from the previous winter, which had already been different from all the winters before her arrival. The house was warmer in a way that was not about the fireplace. Celia's presence had been altering it steadily since September of the previous year, and she was aware of this. She had been adding things, not imposing but incorporating, until the house felt less like a bachelor's practical shelter and more like a place where people actually lived in the full complexity of living. There were curtains now, pale yellow ones she had made herself. There were more books on the shelf, added to the original collection that had been there behind the cedar chest. There were dried flowers in a pottery bowl she had bought from Rosa Vega's neighbor, who made them. There were 2 chairs on the porch now instead of 1, because Cyrus had added the second one in March without comment, and she had loved him for that unreservedly. He was more careful of her in winter, and she allowed it without making it a point of contention. He added her ridge walks to his own schedule without being asked, and without making her feel managed, and she understood the difference between a man who added things to help and a man who removed things to control, and she was grateful every single day that Cyrus Chandler was the former. The baby arrived in June. Her labor was not easy, but it was not the kind of crisis that the stories she had grown up hearing tended to emphasize, and Rosa Vega was there. She had a skillful hand and a calm manner, and she spoke to Celia through the hardest part in Spanish that Celia did not entirely understand but found comforting nevertheless, because the tone was the kind of tone that said, "You are doing well, you are strong, this is hard but you will be all right." The baby was a boy. He was red and loud, and had Cyrus's exact jaw and Celia's eyes, and he weighed 8 pounds 2 ounces by Rosa's estimation, and was the largest thing Celia had ever produced in her life, and she held him with a completeness of feeling that she had not known was available to her. Cyrus had been outside. This was customary. This was how it was done. Men waited outside while the women worked, and when Rosa opened the door and told him he could come in, he had crossed the room and stood over the bed looking at the 2 of them with an expression that was completely open in a way she had only seen him wear twice before in all the time she had known him. Once in the saloon when she read the journal back to him, and once on the ridge when she had told him about the baby. He had reached out very carefully and touched the baby's face with one finger. The baby had closed a fist around it with the automatic grip of the newborn, and something had moved across Cyrus's face that was so large and so complete that Celia had simply watched it with her whole heart. They named him James, after Celia's father. Cyrus had suggested this, which she had not expected, and which had meant more to her than she had immediately been able to say. James Chandler was a healthy, particular, and emphatic infant who developed opinions about things at a pace that amused his father and validated his mother. Cyrus took to fatherhood in the way he took to most things, with quiet competence and an attention to detail that went beyond the practical. He learned which songs calmed James and which did not. He learned the precise quality of silence that meant the baby was actually sleeping versus the silence that meant he was gathering energy for a grievance. He sat in the chair on the porch in the evenings with James on his chest and read the almanac and said nothing in particular. And James, for reasons that were apparently acceptable to James, found this arrangement entirely satisfactory. Celia watched this and loved it and wrote it into the ledger she kept of him that was no longer a private ledger. That was the ledger she had given him on a Christmas morning in their second year together, a new leather book that she had filled with 6 months of the observations she had been accumulating since the beginning, written in the burgundy ink, and the reading of which had kept him very quiet for a long time, and then brought him to her and said things with his hands and his stillness, and the careful way he held her that were the truest version of the poetry he had always had. The ranch grew steadily. The additional cattle acreage that Cyrus had been considering became possible in their second full year when the land to the east, formerly owned by a man who had gone bankrupt in the aftermath of the Marsh dispute, which had apparently been more economically damaging to Marsh's associates than to Cyrus, came available at a fair price. Celia had gone over the numbers for 3 days and told him it was sound. They bought it. Ernesto, who had been Cyrus's right hand for 12 years, and who regarded the progression of events at the ranch with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had waited out a long and difficult season, trained 2 new hands in the spring. Pete Dahlen, remarkably, showed evidence of settling down. He had been walking out with the sister of one of the new hands, a young woman named Consuelo, who was apparently both patient enough for Pete and formidable enough to improve him, and Celia regarded this development with private delight. The second pregnancy came in the spring of their 3rd year together, and this one was easier than James had been, either in the way of second pregnancies or in the way of Celia having a better sense of what her body was doing and being less alarmed by it. This time the baby was a girl, smaller than James, with a temper that was immediately discernible and a quality of focus in her dark eyes that Cyrus said was Celia entirely. They named her Louisa, after Cyrus's mother, and the naming was quiet and considered and held between them without requiring explanation. James, who was 2 years old at the time of Louisa's arrival and had strong opinions about the arrangement of his world, required a period of adjustment. The adjustment was managed by Celia with patience and by Cyrus with a diverting series of practical tasks that James was recruited to assist with, including carrying the mail from the gate to the house and helping fill the water trough, which he did with earnest incompetence and great pride. Life on the Chandler Ranch had acquired a texture and a fullness that Celia sometimes stood back from and examined with the same quality of wonder she had brought to the evening light in her first October here. It was not a soft life. It was a working ranch in New Mexico territory, and it required constant effort, and the land was not always generous, and there were hard seasons and difficult cattle prices, and the ongoing reality of running a household in a place where the nearest large supply point was a day's ride away. None of this was simple, but the life was hers. It was genuinely and fully hers in the way she had wanted it to be when she had answered an advertisement from a man who had said he had no poetry in him, and who had turned out to have, in abundance, exactly that. It was a life that she had built alongside a person who had grown with the building of it, who was still, in his fundamental character, the same careful, deliberate private man she had arrived to find, but who had learned, steadily, and with the specific courage of someone who had been injured by loss, to be known. She still found things. Not always dramatic things, not journals falling open on saloon floors, though she looked back on that particular morning with a complicated and warm feeling that was primarily gratitude for its accidental rightness. Smaller things, a new page tucked into her almanac, the occasional note on the windowsill. Evidence, persistent and thoughtful, that he was still paying attention in the exact quality and depth she had first discovered in those private pages. She still read aloud in the evenings. James was old enough now to sometimes come and sit beside her and listen, though he fell asleep reliably within 10 minutes, which she had decided was not a commentary on her reading ability. Louisa, installed in the cradle her father had made from cedar with an exactness of joinery that was almost unnecessary for a baby, and was pure Cyrus, added a background of small noises to the evenings that were not unpleasant. One evening in their fourth autumn together on the ridge, with the light doing its October thing that was the best light of the year and both of them knowing it by now, Celia had said, "Do you remember what you wrote in the original journal?" He had said, "Which part?" she had said, "Where you wrote that you told me you had no poetry in you." He had been quiet for a moment. "Yes. You said you did not know what to do with it except write it down where I would never see it," she said. He looked at her. The mountains were behind him and the light was on his face, and he was familiar and known and still capable of surprising her, which was exactly the right combination. "He said I was wrong about that," she said, "about the poetry or about me never seeing it." The real smile, full and unhurried, she would never stop storing it. "Both," he said. She laced her fingers through his and they walked down from the ridge in the October dark, and the stars were coming out one by one above the New Mexico territory, and the ranch below had lights in the windows from Ernesto's lamp in the bunkhouse, and the children in the house with Rosa. And Cyrus Chandler squeezed her hand once as they walked, and did not say anything because he did not need to, and she knew exactly what he meant. And she held it in her chest, along with everything else she had been carrying since September 4 years ago, when she had stepped off a train into the hardest and most beautiful sky she had ever seen. He had told her he had no poetry in him. She had found it anyway. She had read it back to him in a room full of people, and she had watched the wall come down, and what was on the other side of it had been worth every month of patience and every careful observation and every 11-day deliberation. It had been worth everything. And out here in the October evening, walking home to a life she had built from the ground up with a man who was still, every single day, the most interesting person she had ever known, she understood that it would keep being worth it. That the finding was not something you did once, that you found a person daily if you were lucky and if you looked. She looked. She had always looked, and what she found every time was him.